Hello, I'm Russell Swanson, and I'd like to briefly review the main ideas from our lecture on Taoism in the ethics course that we are developing. Um, in the lecture on Taoism, I discussed with you some of the historical context for the emergence of Taoism in the period of warring states. I suggested that this was a centuries-long period of disunity, which produced a number of philosophical responses. And the two most important and influential were Confucianism and Taoism. And then I developed through a brief kind of contrast between Taoism and Confucianism by emphasizing that Confucian philosophy developed by Confucius and as transmitted in the writings that were written down by his students in the work called the Analects. Confucian philosophy sort of represents a humanism within the Chinese philosophical tradition. And that's going to sound very familiar to my Western students because Western philosophy is very much dominated by humanism. And we said that humanism can be understood as belief in our abilities, and our capabilities to use observation and thought, and really focuses a lot on our cognitive abilities to sort of, map out and deal with in a successful and meaningful way whatever challenges that life offers us. So we, looked at that famous quote from Confucius that it is not the way that makes humans great, it is humans that make the way great. And that's sort of an emphasis on the way that we need to be conscientious in our reflections upon history and culture in order to find the best way forward. And I made that as a point, I developed that as a point of contrast with Taoist philosophy, which is a form of mysticism. And as I defined that in the opening lecture, that is a philosophy which seeks to develop a balance in our approach to existence. We're not in mystical philosophies asked to throw away our very Homo sapien approach to reality via abstract thought and conceptualization, but mystical philosophies warn us against an over-reliance upon those particularly human capabilities and asks us, and mystical philosophies like Taoism ask us to consider cultivating a different kind of consciousness, a consciousness which does not emphasize the labeling and judging that we do via our abstract thinking capabilities. And instead, we're asked to cultivate a kind of a direct presence, a kind of an ability to be in the moment, here and now, in the moment. It was a 1970s work by a former Western academic who went to India and studied meditation. Richard Alpert became Ram Dass, I think, in the 70s and wrote Be Here Now. And that was a part of a wave of Western thinkers beginning to bring back some of these Eastern ideas, in this case from the Indian subcontinent. But I think that it echoes a kind of a point that I'm developing in philosophical Taoism, and that is that the abstract mind focuses on labeling and judging and identifying patterns in reality, and this is incredibly useful, and it gives rise to language and then culture, and absolutely that is the bread and butter in many respects of Homo sapiens in our approach to existence. But if we are, as we are in the beginning of this course, focused on the question of how to get the most out of existence, we also want to consider that living through our concepts presents perhaps a limited approach to our ability to connect to ourselves and to each other and to life. And so we have to consider that maybe in some sense, the Confucian focus on us making the Tao great, humans making the way of life great, we may want to balance that with some understanding of what it would be like for us to let the way, the Tao, the flow of existence, make us great. And so, we've also focused on this idea of the Tao paradoxically, using language and ideas to point beyond them. We talked about the Tao as the way of life, as the way we want to proceed, as the great oneness of existence that is also always flowing, and therefore is in some sense indefinable. You can't put any sort of conceptual boundaries around it. If you do, you miss it. Hence the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching: the Tao that can be told is not the eternal or true Tao. So we might find our ability to reconnect with the great Tao enhanced by retreating from our cultural world as much as we can, perhaps with a visit to some beautiful, perhaps well-established natural setting. And there we might find that the Tao sort of flows around us in a little bit more of a tangible way. And as we sit there, perhaps in stillness and in silence long enough, we can let the abstract thinking mind, which tends to sort of engage in a kind of a spinning, habitual checklist kind of approach to reality, we might let that kind of slow down and we might become more present to the Tao. And that is the goal. That is the vision of success within the Taoist virtue ethics, to learn to inhabit a position of enlightened consciousness that maybe we could describe as a kind of an ability to be as fully present as possible to our existence, which includes ourselves. It's a very unique way of knowing thyself, and also to existence. And let's just add to each other as well. And in fact, we're not just going to talk about this and point to it and leave us hanging. We're going to describe a virtue that gives us the best chance at achieving this target of enlightened consciousness, and that virtue is Wu Wei. And so we talked a little bit in the lecture on Taoism about the doctrine of Wu Wei, the doctrine of non-action, the doctrine of inaction, sometimes the doctrine of action through non-action. All of these, somewhat paradoxical to try to wrap your mind around, but there is, it turns out, an art that can be practiced where you learn to do nothing on purpose. We're not talking about the normal Netflix binge, with a bowl of ice cream approach that I'm fond of sometimes. We're talking about, some kind of maybe meditative practice or mindfulness practice, some kind of yoga, some kind of attempt to borrow that term from the Indian tradition, to yoke our little selves back to the larger, deeper, more meaningful sense of self. And through our practice of stillness and silence, we can perhaps develop a focus that will serve us well in all the things we do. But more importantly, we can enrich our existence, perhaps with the most special kind of experiences, those often described as sacred or divine by the mystics, often connected in theistic traditions by mystics to, connectedness to God, connectedness to the source, to the creative energy of existence in the living moment, the connection to the mystery of existence, that indefinable Tao. And we do that by just opening ourselves like a flower, opening ourselves to existence and receiving it in a way that is not labeled, if possible, not judged. In that sense, it is sort of forgiven, we might say. And then we open up that space for grace to move through us. And through the practice of Wu Wei, we have a better chance at enriching our existence with this special experience, and also enhancing all the other things that we want to do by doing them with a kind of a greater sense of presence, a greater sense of commitment, and a greater sense of focus. And Wu Wei is referred to in a number of different ways as sort of preferring the yin. We talked about the yin-yang symbol, and how in some sense, the abstract thinking mind sees duality, but this kind of different kind of maybe enlightened or heightened consciousness experiences the unity that transcends or contains the duality that is in some sense brought into existence through human conceptualization. there is a kind of a fundamental oneness here, which we can tap back into. I tried to also say that not only is this a virtue theory about how to get the most out of life, there are some interesting and obvious connections to the sense in which if we were to cultivate this experience and learn to receive it and then inhabit it through a greater sort of familiarity with what this feels like to be in this state, and then turn that, maybe that state, into kind of a way of being, that our ability to interact with the natural world and with other human beings would be probably transformed by that experience of connectedness and oneness in such a way that all of the behaviors that we would think of as typically moral would be enhanced and would become more likely to be the qualities that would inform those relationships. And so while this is primarily a virtue theory focusing on the ancient ethical question of how to get the most out of existence, it has, I think, some obvious implications for how we might also at the same time be better people. And I think that that's a theme I want to highlight here in this brief review just for a second, and say that the virtue theories have an interesting approach to morality, in that instead of imposing morality as kind of a set of rules, it asks that we cultivate a certain way of being, and then it supposes or proposes that we will have morality sort of taken care of as a secondary result of cultivating a certain way of being. To put it maybe very more simply, if we were to find a kind of an inner peace through being fully present to ourselves in a non-judgmental and unlabeled way, and thereby generated an experience of oneness with the world around us, if we could really sort of, through practice, maintain a more steady state approach to existence in that way, be in the flow more often, we would be much more likely to be the kind of patient and kind and loving person that's less likely to do harm to other people, to be ignorant of the way we're doing harm, to be malicious and do harm. And I think the same would probably be true with our relationship to the natural world as a whole. So something very sort of powerful and big about that claim that's worth wrestling with. I did want to, in this brief review, maybe add on just a little bit by going back to a couple of selected poems from the Tao Te Ching, and see if you, as I hope you do, you feel a little bit more able to understand some of the difficult and obscure and often paradoxical sounding language of the poems of the Tao Te Ching. So I'm going to start off by reading with you a translation of poem 28. It says, "Know the male, yet keep to the female." Okay, so know the yang, the labeling, conceptualizing, projecting consciousness through with an interpretive cultural schema out onto the world. Know that approach. You know, that's our bread and butter. But yet, as much as possible, keep to the female, keep to the yin, prefer the yin. Remember to receive. And then literally the next line says, receive the world in your arms. If you receive the world, the Tao, maybe understood as the flow here, will never leave you. And you will be like a little child. I don't know if that sounds, attractive, to be like a little child, but think maybe about the curiosity of a little child. Think about the way in which children are engaged in the world, and think about sort of the beautiful innocence of that way of being. So the next stanza in poem 28 says, know the white, yet keep to the black. Again, the white in the yin yang is the yang, and the black is the yin. So know the white, yet keep to the black. Be a pattern for the world. If you are a pattern for the world in the way that you exist, the Tao will be strong inside of you, really echoing that kind of Star Wars universe notion of the Force is strong with you, right? Like Tao will be strong in you. The way of life can make you great in some sense. So if you are a pattern for the world, the Tao will be strong inside you, and there will be nothing you can't do. Okay, let me step outside the poem for a second and remind you of a famous saying from the Taoist literature. By doing nothing, great deeds are accomplished. This is one translation of a line. I forget the poem that it comes from, but it focuses on if you cultivate Wu Wei, if you act through the Tao, there's nothing you can't do. Great deeds are accomplished, both in terms of everything you do, you will do better, and perhaps the sort of greatest deed or the greatest experience becomes available to you, that sort of sacred experience of connectedness to yourself and to life and to other people in a way that is just often described in mystical literature as joyful, as blissful, as sort of your cup running over with energy and creativity. Okay, so I'm going to jump down to the fourth stanza here and finish poem 28. The world is formed from the void. Okay, reality as we know it is formed from sort of an emptiness. The definable, the world of the 10,000 different things is formed from the one undefined thing. The world is formed from the void, like utensils from a block of wood. The master, right, the enlightened person, knows the utensils, but keeps to the block. Knows the 10,000 things, but always focuses on the oneness and the undefinable. The master knows the utensils, but keeps to the block. Thus, she can use all things. Okay, so that's poem 28. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense to you after our lecture on Taoism and this review. Let me go ahead and just finish up here with poem 78 out of the 81 poems of the Tao Te Ching. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. The soft overcomes the hard, the gentle overcomes the rigid. Everyone knows this is true, but few can put it into practice. So you often hear a lot of metaphors. That's about half that poem, but you often hear in Taoist literature these poems about water. You may also famously think about like a martial arts character like Bruce Lee talking about being like water, flowing, right, like water, and meeting things, and instead of trying to push through things, happen to things, water always just readily flows right around any resistance found in existence. So there's some very interesting, I think, martial arts applications of these concepts, and they produce kind of the antithesis or spectrum between the hard forms like karate and the softer forms, maybe like Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu or ultimately Tai Chi itself, where the goal is to really flow and to not provide any resistance to the force one meets. And yet this doesn't mean that we don't find an effective way to deal with reality. I mean, the Grand Canyon was carved by water. The hard, the rigid is always over time overcome by the soft and by the yielding. There is a strength in this ability to receive. Okay, that completes our review of the lecture on Taoism. I wish you well.